In the hushed moments before dawn on May 29th, 1453, Constantinople lay suspended between worlds, between the dying ember of Byzantine glory and the rising flame of Ottoman ambition. The Bosphorus stretched like a silver thread beneath the city's ancient walls, carrying upon its currents the whispered prayers of emperors and the dreams of conquerors. Here, where Europe kissed Asia across the narrowest of waters, stood the last bastion of an empire that had endured for over 1,000 years. The morning light revealed a city that was itself a bridge, not merely between continents, but between ages, between faiths, between the classical world and the medieval, between the known and the unknowable. Constantinople had been many things to many peoples. Nova Roma to Constantine, the queen of cities, to the Byzantines, Constantinople to the Ottomans who would claim it. But on this morning, it was something else entirely. It was the final page of a story that had begun when Rome itself was young. The city's silhouette against the dawn was a testament to human aspiration made manifest in stone and gold. The great dome of Hagia Sophia caught the first rays of sunlight, its surface seeming to glow with an inner fire that spoke of divine presence and human artistry united in perfect harmony. Below it, the tiered roofs of the great palace descended toward the sea like a cascade of architectural poetry, each building telling its own story of imperial grandeur and Byzantine sophistication. Yet for all its beauty, there was something elegiac in the morning air, a sense of endings approaching with the inexorable certainty of tide and time. The very stones seemed to whisper of the 1,000 years they had witnessed, the rise and fall of emperors, the schisms of churches, the thunder of armies at the gates. They had seen crusaders and Bulgars, Arabs and Normans all break themselves against Rome, heave walls like waves against an eternal shore. The city's inhabitants moved through their morning routines with the quiet dignity of those who understood that they were living through history itself. In the shadow of the Theodosian walls, those mighty fortifications that had protected the city for over 1,000 years, shopkeepers opened their stalls, priests prepared for morning prayers, and soldiers checked their weapons with the methodical care of men who knew that this day would be unlike any other. Beyond the walls, stretching across the hills of Thrace like a vast dark carpet, lay the Ottoman encampment. Here was gathered the greatest military force the world had yet seen, cannons that could shatter stone, janissaries trained from childhood in the arts of war, and ships that had crossed continents to reach this moment. At the center of it all, in a tent that rivaled the palaces of kings, sat Mehmed II, the young sultan who had dreamed of this moment since boyhood. The contrast was stark and poignant. Within the walls, the last defenders of a dying empire. Beyond them, the vanguard of a new age. Christianity and Islam, East and West, tradition and innovation, all converged here at the crossroads of the world, where the fate of civilizations would be decided not by philosophers or theologians, but by the ancient arbiters of human destiny: courage, steel, and blood. As the sun climbed higher, its rays illuminated the full tragedy of what was about to unfold. This was not merely the siege of a city, but the death of a world. The Constantinople that had preserved the learning of antiquity through the dark centuries, that had been the beating heart of Orthodox Christianity, that had served as the bridge between ancient Rome and medieval Europe. This Constantinople was about to breathe its last. Yet there was beauty in this ending, the kind of terrible beauty that attends all great tragedies. For in choosing to defend their city against impossible odds, the Byzantines had chosen to write the final chapter of their story in letters of gold and crimson. They had chosen to make their ending worthy of their beginning, to ensure that when the last bell tolled from the last church, it would toll for an empire that had died as it had lived, with dignity, with faith, and with the unshakable conviction that some things are worth dying for. The morning breeze carried the scent of incense from the churches and the smoke of campfires from the Turkish lines, mingling them in the air above the city like a prayer offered by history itself. Soon, very soon, the great guns would speak their thunderous judgment and the world would change forever. But for now, in these last precious moments of peace, Constantinople remained what it had always been, a city of dreams, suspended between earth and heaven, between past and future, between the mortal and the eternal. To understand the magnitude of what was about to be lost, one must journey backward through the corridors of time to witness the birth of this extraordinary city. Constantinople's story began not with Constantine the Great, but with the deeper currents of human ambition that had drawn civilizations to this singular point where two continents almost touch, where the Mediterranean world opens into the vast expanse of the Black Sea. The location itself was destiny made manifest in geography. Here, the Golden Horn curved like a scimitar into the heart of the European shore, creating a natural harbour so perfect that ancient mariners spoke of it as a gift from the gods. The hills that rose above this harbour commanded views that stretched to the horizon in every direction, offering both defensive advantage and commercial opportunity. When the Greek colonists from Megara first established Byzantium in the 7th century BCE, they were not merely founding a city, they were planting the seed of empire at the crossroads of the world. But it was Constantine who transformed this strategic advantage into imperial vision. In 324 CE, as the Roman Empire convulsed with civil war and religious transformation, the emperor looked eastward and saw not just a new capital, but a new Rome, one that would be Christian from its foundation, unmarked by the pagan associations that clung to the 7 hills of the eternal city. The dedication ceremonies of 330 CE lasted 40 days, and throughout that time, the emperor walked the boundaries of his new city, marking out a perimeter that would encompass not just the old Byzantium, but vast new territories that spoke to his limitless ambition. The city that rose from Constantine's vision was unlike anything the world had seen. Here, Christian basilicas stood alongside Roman forums, Eastern mysticism mingled with Western law, and the accumulated wisdom of centuries found new expression in marble and mosaic. The Hagia Sophia, completed under Justinian in 537 CE, became the supreme embodiment of this synthesis, a building that was simultaneously the largest cathedral in Christendom and the most sophisticated architectural achievement of its age. Yet Constantinople was never merely a museum of past glories. It was a living, breathing entity that adapted and evolved with each century. When the Western Roman Empire crumbled in the 5th century, Constantinople became the sole inheritor of Roman legitimacy. When Islam swept across the Near East in the 7th century, the city became the bulwark of Christian resistance. When the Renaissance began to stir in the West, Constantinople's scholars were already preserving and transmitting the classical texts that would fuel that rebirth. The empire that called this city home was itself a marvel of cultural synthesis. Byzantine civilization merged Roman legal traditions with Greek intellectual heritage, Christian theology with imperial ceremony, Eastern mysticism with Western pragmatism. The result was a culture of extraordinary sophistication and resilience, one that could produce simultaneously the philosophical subtleties of John Chrysostom and the military genius of Belisarius, the mystical theology of Pseudo-Dionysius, and the historical chronicles of Procopius. Trade routes converged on Constantinople like arteries carrying the lifeblood of the medieval world. Silk from China, spices from India, furs from Russia, amber from the Baltic, all passed through the city's markets, generating wealth that funded not just military campaigns, but also the greatest artistic and intellectual achievements of the medieval period. The city's merchant quarters hummed with a dozen languages, its workshops produced goods that were prized from Baghdad to London, and its gold solidus served as the standard currency of international trade for over 7 centuries. The imperial court itself was a theatre of unprecedented magnificence. The great palace complex sprawled across terraces that descended toward the sea, its halls decorated with mosaics that transformed light into living art. The throne room, with its mechanical lions that roared and birds that sang, impressed visitors as a place where heaven and earth intersected. The emperor, robed in purple silk and crowned with jewels that caught the light like captured stars, was understood to be not merely a ruler, but God's vice-regent on earth. Yet for all its splendor, the empire was never immune to the forces of historical change. The rise of Islam in the 7th century cost Byzantium its richest provinces in Egypt and Syria. The Crusades of the 11th and 12th centuries brought Western armies that were sometimes allies, sometimes enemies, but always foreigners who failed to understand the subtle complexities of Eastern Christianity. The sack of Constantinople by the Fourth Crusade in 1204 was a wound from which the empire never fully recovered, fragmenting Byzantine territory and weakening the central authority that had held the empire together for 8 centuries. The Palaiologos restoration of 1261 brought the Byzantines back to their capital, but it was a diminished empire that they ruled. The great themes that had once extended from the Danube to the Euphrates were now reduced to a few scattered territories. The navy that had once commanded the eastern Mediterranean was a shadow of its former self. The treasury that had once been the richest in the world was chronically empty, reduced to debasing its currency and pawning its crown jewels. Yet even in decline, Constantinople retained its essential character as a bridge between worlds. Its scholars continued to preserve and transmit the classical tradition, its artisans maintained their reputation for unparalleled skill, and its emperors, though ruling over territories that could be crossed in a few days' journey, continued to bear the proud title of Emperor of the Romans. The city's schools still taught the works of Plato and Aristotle. Its libraries still housed manuscripts that dated back to antiquity, and its churches still echoed with the same liturgy that had been chanted there for over 1,000 years. As the 15th century dawned, Constantinople had become something unique in the medieval world, a city that was simultaneously ancient and eternal, reduced and magnificent, dying and immortal. It was the last guardian of treasures that the world could ill afford to lose, the final keeper of memories that stretched back to the foundation of Christian civilization. And it was this city, this repository of human achievement and divine aspiration, that now faced its greatest trial. The sounds of the approaching siege, the rumble of cannon wheels, the march of countless feet, the prayers of soldiers preparing for battle were already audible to those who knew how to listen. But within the walls, life continued with the quiet dignity of those who understood that they were living through the end of an age, that they were the last custodians of a flame that had burned for over a millennium, and that their duty was to ensure that when that flame finally flickered out, it would do so with a light bright enough to illuminate the darkness of the centuries to come. From the Anatolian highlands, where shepherds once drove their flocks through mountain passes, there emerged in the 13th century a force that would reshape the map of the world. The Ottomans began not as conquerors, but as Ghazis, warriors of the faith who saw themselves as defenders of Islam's frontier against the Christian powers of Byzantium. Their early leaders were men of the steppes who understood that empires were built not just with the sword, but with the ability to transform victory into lasting institutions. Osman I, the dynasty's founder, established more than a state. He created a vision of Islamic expansion that would transcend tribal boundaries and ethnic divisions. His followers were drawn from the restless populations of Anatolia, Turkmen nomads seeking new pastures, displaced farmers fleeing Mongol devastation, adventurers and mystics who saw in the Ottoman cause a divine purpose. What united them was not just shared faith, but a shared understanding that they were participating in the unfolding of God's plan for the world. The genius of early Ottoman expansion lay in its capacity for synthesis. Unlike previous Islamic conquerors who had swept across vast territories only to see their empires fragment within generations, the Ottomans built institutions that could accommodate diversity while maintaining unity. Christian sipahis rode alongside Muslim akinjis, Greek administrators served in the same chanceries as Turkish bureaucrats, and the sultans themselves took Christian wives and employed Christian advisors without seeing any contradiction between religious faith and political pragmatism. By the middle of the 15th century, the Ottoman Empire had become the dominant power in southeastern Europe and Western Asia. The great victories at Kosovo and Ankara had established Ottoman military supremacy, while the conquest of Adrianople had provided the empire with the European capital that rivaled Constantinople itself. Yet for all these achievements, the Ottomans remained haunted by the presence of the Byzantine capital, that golden city that sat like a jewel at the center of Ottoman territories, dividing the empire's European and Asian domains. It was into this world of expanding Ottoman power that Mehmed II was born in 1432. From his earliest years, the young prince was groomed for greatness by tutors who understood that he was destined to rule an empire that spanned 3 continents. His education was comprehensive in the manner of Renaissance princes. He studied not only the Quran and Islamic law, but also the works of Aristotle and Plato, the histories of Alexander and Caesar, the poetry of Rumi and Hafez. He spoke Turkish, Arabic, Persian, Greek, and Latin with equal fluency, and his court became a center of learning that attracted scholars from across the Islamic world. Yet beneath this scholarly exterior burned an ambition that was both personal and dynastic. Mehmed had grown up hearing stories of the great Muslim conquerors who had carried the banner of Islam to the gates of Vienna and the shores of the Atlantic. He had studied the campaigns of Saladin and Baybars, of Alp Arslan and Mahmud of Ghazni, and he understood that his own place in history would be determined by his ability to complete what they had begun, the transformation of the Islamic world from a collection of competing states into a unified empire capable of challenging Christian Europe on equal terms. The key to this transformation lay in Constantinople. The city's strategic position made it the natural capital of any empire that sought to unite Europe and Asia under a single rule. Its symbolic importance as the heir to Rome and the seat of Eastern Christianity made its conquest a religious as well as political imperative, and its cultural significance as the repository of classical learning and Byzantine civilization made its capture essential for any ruler who sought to present himself as the successor to the great empires of antiquity. Mehmed's preparations for the siege were meticulous and comprehensive. He understood that previous Ottoman attempts to take the city had failed because they had relied on traditional siege methods against fortifications that were designed to withstand such attacks. The Theodosian walls had been erected in the 5th century by engineers who understood the art of defensive architecture better than any of their contemporaries, and they had been strengthened and modernized by successive generations of Byzantine builders. The solution lay in the new science of artillery. Mehmed gathered around him the most skilled cannon makers of his time, including the Hungarian engineer Orban, who had first offered his services to the Byzantines, but had been turned away because they could not meet his price. Under Mehmed's patronage, Orban constructed guns of unprecedented size and power, weapons that could throw stone balls weighing over 600 pounds with enough force to shatter the strongest walls. But artillery alone would not be sufficient. The siege would require a coordination of land and sea forces that had never been attempted before. Mehmed ordered the construction of a fleet that could challenge Byzantine control of the Golden Horn, and he assembled an army that included not just Turkish warriors, but also janissaries from the Balkans, engineers from Hungary, and volunteers from across the Islamic world who saw the siege as a holy war. The psychological preparation was as important as the military preparation. Mehmed understood that he was not just attacking a city, but challenging the last remnant of an empire that had once ruled the world. He commissioned scholars to write treatises proving that the conquest of Constantinople was foretold in Islamic prophecy, and he encouraged his soldiers to see themselves as the instruments of divine will. At the same time, he studied the Byzantine sources that described the city's defenses, and he learned to speak Greek so that he could communicate directly with captured defenders. The young sultan's vision extended far beyond the immediate military campaign. He saw Constantinople not as a prize to be plundered, but as a capital to be transformed. He planned to make it the center of a new Islamic empire that would synthesize the best elements of Byzantine, Islamic, and Renaissance civilizations. The city's great churches would become mosques, but they would retain their architectural grandeur. The city's scholars would be protected and honored, but they would serve Ottoman rather than Byzantine masters. The city's trade routes would remain open, but they would serve Ottoman rather than Byzantine interests. As the spring of 1453 approached, Mehmed's preparations reached their climax. The great guns were transported to the walls of the city under cover of darkness. The Ottoman fleet was assembled in the harbours of the Bosphorus, and the army that had gathered around the city's walls numbered over 100,000 men. The young sultan, now 21 years old, stood on the hills overlooking Constantinople and saw before him the realization of a dream that had consumed him since childhood. Yet even as he prepared to launch the final assault, Mehmed understood the magnitude of what he was attempting. He was not just attacking a city, but bringing to an end a civilization that had existed for over 1,000 years. The empire that had preserved the learning of antiquity, that had been the bulwark of Christianity in the East, that had served as the bridge between the ancient and medieval worlds. This empire was about to pass into history, and he would be the instrument of its passing. The weight of this responsibility was both exhilarating and sobering. As he stood beneath the stars on the night before the siege began, Mehmed II understood that he was about to become either the greatest conqueror of his age or the architect of a catastrophe that would echo through the centuries. The city that lay before him, with its golden domes and marble palaces, its ancient walls and sacred churches, was about to test everything he had learned about war, about faith, about the nature of power itself. The crescent moon that hung above the Ottoman camp seemed to smile down upon the young sultan's ambitions, but even celestial approval could not guarantee success. Tomorrow would bring the test of arms, and only God knew whether the rising crescent would eclipse the double eagle of Byzantium, or whether the ancient walls would prove stronger than the modern weapons arrayed against them. Constantine XI, Palaiologos, assumed the purple of empire in 1449, inheriting a throne that had once commanded the loyalty of millions, but now ruled over little more than the city of Constantinople itself and a handful of scattered territories. The irony was not lost on him. He bore the same name as the great Constantine who had founded the city over 1,000 years before. Yet where his namesake had built an empire, he would preside over its end. The new emperor was a man shaped by the harsh realities of Byzantine decline. Born in 1405, he had witnessed the empire's steady erosion throughout his lifetime. Territories lost to the Ottomans, cities abandoned to economic collapse, provinces reduced to negotiating their own terms with foreign powers. His brothers had already carved out their own separate despotates in the Morea, acknowledging through their actions that the old unity of the empire was beyond restoration. Constantine himself had ruled as despot of the Morea before his elevation to the imperial throne, and his experiences there had taught him hard lessons about the gap between imperial titles and imperial power. Unlike many of his predecessors, Constantine harbored no illusions about the magnitude of the crisis facing his empire. He understood that the traditional Byzantine strategies of diplomacy and delay, of playing one enemy against another and buying time through tribute and concessions, were no longer viable. The Ottoman Empire had grown too powerful, too unified, too determined to be deflected by such tactics. The question was no longer whether Constantinople would fall, but whether it would fall with honor. The emperor's character was forged in the crucible of impossible choices. His first great dilemma came with the question of religious unity. For decades, Byzantine emperors had sought Western aid against the Ottoman threat, But such aid came with strings attached, specifically the reunification of the Eastern and Western churches under papal authority. The theological differences between Greek Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism had been hardening for centuries, and the Fourth Crusade's sack of Constantinople in 1204 had left deep wounds that had never healed. Yet Constantine understood that without Western aid, the city could not survive. He endorsed the union of the churches proclaimed at the Council of Florence in 1439, knowing that this decision would divide his own people and undermine the very orthodox identity that had sustained the empire through centuries of persecution. The emperor's pragmatism was profound and tragic. He was willing to sacrifice the religious purity of his empire for the chance to preserve its political existence. The domestic opposition to this policy was fierce and immediate. Many of Constantine's subjects preferred Ottoman rule to reunion with Rome, seeing the Turks as merely another temporal power while viewing papal authority as a corruption of the true faith. The emperor found himself caught between the theological intransigence of his Orthodox subjects and the political demands of his potential Western allies. It was a position that would have broken a lesser man, but Constantine bore it with the dignity of one who understood that leadership sometimes required accepting the hatred of those one sought to protect. His military preparations were hampered by the empire's chronic financial weakness. The great treasury that had once funded armies and fleets was empty, reduced to melting down palace ornaments to pay for basic supplies. The emperor pawned his own crown jewels to buy grain for the city's inhabitants, and he spent his personal fortune on weapons and fortifications. Yet even these desperate measures were insufficient to remedy the fundamental imbalance between Byzantine resource and Ottoman power. Constantine's diplomatic efforts were equally frustrating. His embassies to the west generated much sympathy, but little concrete aid. Venice and Genoa were too concerned with their own commercial interests to risk a major war with the Ottomans. Hungary and Poland were preoccupied with their own borders. The Pope offered spiritual support, but little military assistance. The emperor's letters to Western monarchs grew increasingly desperate as the Ottoman threat materialized, yet the responses remained polite but non-committal. The psychological burden of his position was perhaps the heaviest of all. Constantine knew that he was not just the ruler of a declining empire, but the last custodian of a civilization that had endured for over a millennium. In his hands lay the responsibility for institutions that trace their origins to the foundation of Christian Rome, for traditions that had been maintained through the Dark Ages when Western Europe was struggling to remember its own classical heritage, for a continuity of governance that stretched back to Augustus Caesar himself. Yet there was also a strange freedom in this knowledge. Released from the normal constraints of imperial calculation, Constantine could focus on the more fundamental questions of duty and honor. He understood that his reign would be measured not by its duration or its conquests, but by the manner of its ending. The emperor, who had inherited an empire in ruins, had the opportunity to transform that ending into something noble and transcendent. His personal relationships revealed the depth of his character. Constantine never married, perhaps understanding that the dynasty would end with him and seeing no point in creating new hostages to fortune. Yet he maintained close ties with his brothers and showed genuine affection for his subjects, often walking among them in the streets of Constantinople and List, eaning to their concerns with the patience of a parish priest rather than the hauteur of an emperor. The emperor's daily routine during the final months of his reign reflected his understanding of his dual role as temporal ruler and spiritual guardian. He spent his mornings attending to the practical aspects of defense, inspecting fortifications, reviewing military preparations, meeting with foreign emissaries. His afternoons were devoted to the spiritual welfare of his people, attending services at Hagia Sophia, visiting the city's monasteries, praying at the tombs of his predecessors. It was as if he sought to compress into these final months all the duties that his line had performed for over 1,000 years. As the Ottoman siege preparations became visible on the hills surrounding the city, Constantine's demeanor grew increasingly solemn, but also increasingly resolute. He understood that he was about to face the supreme test of his reign and his character. The emperor who had inherited a dying empire would have the opportunity to show that empires, like men, could choose the manner of their deaths. His final preparations were both practical and symbolic. He distributed his remaining wealth among the city's defenders, endowed monasteries and churches for the salvation of his soul, and made his peace with God through confession and prayer. Yet he also sharpened his sword, donned his armor, and prepared to die as a soldier rather than a suppliant. The last emperor of Byzantium understood that his legacy would be written not in the chancery documents of diplomacy, but in the blood and dust of the final battle for his city. The weight of 1,000 years of history pressed down upon Constantine's shoulders as he stood on the walls of his capital and watched the Ottoman army take its positions. He was no longer just a man defending his city, but the living embodiment of an entire civilization making its final stand against the forces of change. In his person was concentrated all the glory and tragedy of Byzantine history, the theological disputes and artistic achievements, the military victories and diplomatic failures, the cultural syntheses and political fragmentations that had defined the empire's long existence. Yet Constantine XI, Palaiologos, was not just a symbol, but a man, and like all men, he faced the approach of death with a mixture of fear and courage, doubt and faith. The emperor, who would soon die for his city, understood that he was about to join the ranks of those who had chosen duty over survival, honor over compromise, principle over pragmatism. In the final analysis, that choice would define not just his reign, but his civilization's last and greatest moment. The winter of 1452-1453 marked the final diplomatic dance between the dying Byzantine Empire and the rising Ottoman power. A delicate choreography of threats and negotiations that both sides understood was merely the prelude to inevitable war. Across the courts of Europe, ambassadors carried urgent messages between capitals, their dispatches filled with the formal language of diplomacy, but underlaid with the growing recognition that the medieval world was approaching one of its great turning points. The Ottoman preparations began with characteristic thoroughness. Mehmed II understood that the siege of Constantinople would require not just military force, but a complete reorganization of his empire's resources. From the foundries of Adrianople came the great guns that would batter the Theodosian walls, their bronze barrels cast by craftsmen who had learned their art from the masters of Hungary and Italy. The logistics of moving these massive weapons across the rough terrain of Thrace required the construction of new roads and bridges, the mobilization of thousands of oxen and horses, and the coordination of supply lines that stretched across half the empire. The recruitment of the Ottoman army revealed the cosmopolitan nature of Mehmed's empire. The core of his forces consisted of the Janissaries, the elite infantry corps recruited from Christian children and trained from youth in the arts of war and Islamic faith. These soldiers, numbering perhaps 12,000, were the most disciplined and feared troops in the world, their distinctive white felt caps and curved swords, symbols of Ottoman military supremacy. Around them gathered the Sipahis, the feudal cavalry of the empire, drawing their strength from the Taimars granted them in exchange for military service. Yet the army that assembled around Constantinople was more than just a Turkish force. Volunteers came from across the Islamic world, drawn by the prospect of participating in a holy war against the last Christian stronghold in the east. Arab warriors from Syria and Egypt, Berber horsemen from North Africa, Turkmen nomads from the steppes of Central Asia, all answered the Sultan's call for a final assault on the capital of Eastern Christianity. The diversity of languages, customs, and fighting styles created challenges of command and coordination, but it also demonstrated the extent to which the Ottoman cause had captured the imagination of the entire Islamic world. The construction of the Ottoman fleet required even greater logistical sophistication. The Golden Horn was protected by a massive chain that stretched from Constantinople to the Genoese colony of Galata, and any successful siege would require naval forces capable of challenging Byzantine control of these waters. Ottoman shipyards from the Black Sea to the Aegean worked through the winter months, constructing galleys and transport vessels that could carry the siege to the water approaches of the city. The most dramatic of Mehmed's preparations was the construction of the fortress of Rumeli Hisari on the European shore of the Bosphorus. Built in just 4 months during 1452, this massive fortification commanded the narrowest point of the strait and gave the Ottomans the ability to control all maritime traffic between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. The fortress's completion marked the end of Constantinople's ability to receive aid or supplies by sea, transforming the city from a strategic crossroads into an isolated island surrounded by Ottoman power. The Byzantine response to these preparations was hampered by the empire's chronic weakness, but Constantine XI did what he could with the limited resources at his disposal. The emperor's letters to Western monarchs grew increasingly urgent as the Ottoman threat materialized, but the responses remained frustratingly vague. Venice and Genoa expressed sympathy but cited commercial considerations that made direct military intervention impossible. The Pope offered spiritual support and promised to preach a crusade, but the age of great crusading armies was long past, and the response from European nobility was lukewarm at best. The most significant Western aid came from individual adventurers and mercenaries rather than from official state sources. Giovanni Giustiniani, a Genoese condottiere with extensive experience in siege warfare, arrived in Constantinople in January 1453 with 700 well-armed followers. His presence brought both military expertise and a morale boost to the city's defenders, and Constantine immediately appointed him commander of the land defenses. The emperor understood that while Giustiniani's force was small, it represented the kind of professional military experience that the Byzantine forces lacked. The city's internal preparations revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of its position. The Theodosian walls, rebuilt and reinforced over the centuries, remained formidable obstacles that had turned back every previous assault. The defenders worked through the winter months to repair damage from recent earthquakes and to strengthen the fortifications against the new threat posed by Ottoman artillery. The outer wall was backed by a second line of defense, and beyond that lay the inner wall that had never been breached by enemy action. Yet the city's population had shrunk dramatically from its medieval peak of perhaps 400,000 to fewer than 100,000 inhabitants. Whole quarters lay empty and abandoned, their buildings slowly crumbling from neglect. The defenders could muster perhaps 7,000 men capable of bearing arms, including the foreign volunteers, a pitifully small force to defend nearly 14 miles of walls and coastline. The emperor was forced to make difficult decisions about which sections of the fortifications could be adequately defended and which would have to be abandoned if the siege turned against them. The religious dimension of the coming conflict cast a shadow over all the military preparations. Both sides understood that they were not just fighting for territory or political advantage, but for the validation of their respective faiths. The Ottomans saw the conquest of Constantinople as the fulfillment of Islamic prophecy, the completion of the Holy War that had begun with the Prophet Muhammad's first victories in Arabia. The Byzantines saw their defense of the city as a sacred duty to preserve the last bastion of Eastern Christianity and to protect the holy sites that had been in Christian hands for over a millennium. The psychological warfare began months before the first shots were fired. Ottoman raiders swept through the countryside around Constantinople, carrying off livestock and captives while demonstrating the helplessness of the Byzantine authorities. The city's inhabitants watched from their walls as smoke rose from burning villages, knowing that each column of smoke represented communities that had been part of the empire for centuries. The message was clear. The Ottomans could strike wherever they chose, while the Byzantines could only wait behind their walls for the inevitable assault. The approach of spring brought a sense of fatalism to the city's inhabitants. The emperor continued his diplomatic efforts, but even his most optimistic advisors acknowledged that no significant Western aid would arrive in time to affect the outcome of the siege. The city's priests preached about the need for repentance and divine intervention, while the military commanders focused on the practical aspects of defense. The population as a whole seemed to accept that they were about to witness the end of an age and their beheading. Avia took on the dignity of those who understood that they were living through history. The final diplomatic exchanges between Mehmed and Constantine revealed the gulf that separated their positions. The Sultan offered terms that would have allowed the emperor to retire to the Morea with a generous pension, but Constantine refused to abandon his city and his people. The emperor's response was reportedly brief and dignified. He would prefer to die rather than witness the destruction of his empire. It was a choice that transformed a military defeat into a moral victory, ensuring that the last emperor of Byzantium would be remembered not as a ruler who fled from his responsibilities, but as a man who chose duty over survival. As the Ottoman forces took their final positions around the city's walls, the stage was set for one of history's most dramatic confrontations. The largest army of the medieval world was about to assault the most formidable fortifications of the age, with the fate of two civilizations hanging in the balance. The preparations were complete, the prayers had been said, and the weapons had been blessed. All that remained was to discover whether the rising Crescent would eclipse the double eagle of Byzantium, or whether the ancient walls would prove stronger than the modern weapons arrayed against them. The Ottoman guns opened fire on April 6, 1453, their thunderous voices announcing the beginning of the end for the last remnant of the Roman Empire. The sound was unlike anything the world had heard before, not the sharp crack of conventional weapons, but a deep, rolling roar that seemed to emerge from the very bowels of the earth. The great cannon constructed by Orban, the Hungarian engineer, hurled stone balls weighing over 600 pounds with such force that they could be heard approaching their targets, whistling through the air like the voices of demons before smashing into the ancient stones of the Theodosian walls. The psychological impact of this bombardment was perhaps as significant as its physical effects. The inhabitants of Constantinople had lived their entire lives in the shadow of walls that had never been breached, fortifications that had turned back Arab armies, Bulgarian hordes, and crusader forces with equal effectiveness. The sight of these mighty defences crumbling under the impact of Ottoman artillery shattered more than stone. It shattered the faith of generations who had believed that their city was divinely protected, that the Virgin Mary herself had extended her mantle over the Queen of Cities. Yet the physical destruction was devastating in its own right. The outer wall, which had stood for over 1,000 years, began to develop cracks and gaps that widened with each day of bombardment. The defenders worked frantically to repair the damage, hauling stones and timber through the nights to shore up the weakening fortifications. Women and children joined the work gangs, carrying baskets of earth and rubble to fill the breaches. The elderly and infirm contributed whatever they could, some donating their furniture and personal belongings to be used as building materials, others offering their prayers and encouragement to the exhausted workers. The rhythm of the siege quickly established itself in the daily life of the city. Each dawn brought renewed bombardment, the great guns speaking their message of destruction with methodical regularity. The defenders learned to read the signs, the puff of smoke that preceded each discharge, the whistle of the approaching projectile, the crash of impact that sent shockwaves through the ground. Between bombardments came the work of repair, the tending of the wounded, and the constant vigilance against surprise attacks. Giovanni Giustiniani proved himself a master of defensive warfare, organizing the city's resistance with the skill of a professional soldier. He divided the walls into sections, each under the command of a trusted officer, and established a system of rapid response that could concentrate defenders at any point where the Ottomans might attempt a breakthrough. His Genoese crossbowmen, positioned at key points along the fortifications, provided covering fire that made Ottoman approaches costly and difficult. The emperor himself became a constant presence on the walls, moving from section to section to encourage the defenders and assess the damage. Constantine XI had transformed himself from a diplomatic ruler into a warrior emperor, trading his imperial robes for armor and taking his place alongside the common soldiers in the defense of his city. His presence was a powerful symbol of resistance, demonstrating that the empire's last ruler would not abandon his people in their hour of greatest need. The Ottoman assault strategy revealed Mehmed's sophisticated understanding of siege warfare. Rather than attempting a direct assault on the strongest sections of the walls, he focused his artillery on creating multiple breaches that would force the defenders to spread their limited forces thin. The systematic bombardment was accompanied by constant probing attacks, skirmish, designed to test the defenders' resolve and identify weak points in their defenses. The famous chain that protected the Golden Horn became a particular focus of Ottoman attention. This massive barrier, stretched between Constantinople and the Genoese colony of Galata, had protected the city's harbour for centuries. The Ottomans understood that breaking this chain would allow them to bring their fleet into the heart of the city's defences, creating new angles of attack and forcing the defenders to guard against assault from the sea as well as from the land. The first major test of the siege came on April 18th, when the Ottomans launched a coordinated attack on the Theodosian walls. The assault began before dawn, with Ottoman infantry attempting to exploit the gaps created by the artillery bombardment. The defenders responded with desperate courage, pouring Greek fire and boiling oil on the attackers, while maintaining a constant rain of arrows and crossbow bolts. The battle raged for hours, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. The sight of the assault was both terrifying and magnificent. The Ottoman Janissaries advanced with their characteristic discipline, their white caps and curved swords gleaming in the morning sun. Behind them came waves of irregular troops, volunteers from across the Islamic world who saw the siege as a holy war against Christianity. The defenders met them with equal determination. Byzantine soldiers fighting alongside Genoese mercenaries and Venetian sailors in a desperate alliance of Christian powers. The role of the civilian population became increasingly important as the siege progressed. The city's inhabitants understood that their survival depended on the success of the defense, and they contributed to the war effort with remarkable dedication. Women served as nurses and ammunition carriers, children acted as messengers and lookouts, and even the clergy abandoned their usual roles to serve as labourers and fighters. The siege transformed Constantinople from a city into a fortress, with every inhabitant becoming a participant in the struggle for survival. The psychological warfare conducted by both sides added another dimension to the conflict. The Ottomans sought to undermine the defenders' morale through displays of overwhelming force and promises of mercy for those who surrendered. They paraded captured Byzantine prisoners before the walls, some of whom were released to carry messages urging surrender. The defenders responded with their own displays of defiance, hanging Ottoman banners upside down from the walls and making speeches about preferring death to dishonor. The religious dimension of the siege became increasingly prominent as the bombardment continued. Both sides saw the conflict as a test of their faith, with victory or defeat reflecting divine approval or displeasure. The Ottomans performed their daily prayers in sight of the city walls, their calls to prayer echoing across the battlefield 5 times each day. The Byzantines responded with their own religious observances, carrying icons and relics along the walls and holding special services in the churches of the city. The supply situation within the city became increasingly desperate as the siege tightened. The Ottoman control of the Bosphorus prevented any relief supplies from reaching the city by sea, while their dominance of the surrounding countryside made overland supply impossible. The defenders were forced to rely on the stores that had been accumulated before the siege began, carefully rationing food and water, while knowing that each day brought them closer to starvation. The nights during the siege were filled with activity as both sides prepared for the next day's fighting. The defenders worked to repair the damage inflicted by the day's bombardment, while the Ottomans moved their artillery pieces to new positions and prepared for fresh assaults. The sounds of construction and preparation echoed across the darkened battlefield, punctuated by the occasional exchange of fire between sentries. The international implications of the siege were not lost on either side. The Ottoman success would establish them as the dominant power in the Eastern Mediterranean and open the way for further expansion into Europe. The Byzantine defeat would mark the end of the last connection between the modern world and the classical civilization of Greece and Rome. Both sides understood that they were fighting not just for territory or political advantage, but for the right to shape the future of an entire region. As April gave way to May, the siege settled into a pattern of systematic destruction and desperate resistance. The Ottoman bombardment continued to erode the city's defenses, while the defenders fought with the courage of men who knew that they were facing annihilation. The great guns spoke their message of doom with monotonous regularity, but the walls of Constantinople, though cracked and battered, still stood between the Ottoman army and the heart of the last Christian empire in the East. The stage was set for the final act of this thousand-year drama, as the forces of two civilizations prepared for the climactic battle that would determine the fate of the city that had stood as a bridge between worlds for over a millennium. The ancient stones of the Theodosian walls, witness to so many sieges and assaults, prepared to face their ultimate test against the modern weapons of a new age. On the morning of April 22, 1453, the defenders of Constantinople witnessed what seemed impossible: a fleet of Ottoman ships sailing in the waters of the Golden Horn, behind the great chain that was supposed to protect the city's harbour. The sight struck them with the force of a thunderbolt, for the chain had been their ultimate guarantee of security, the one barrier that they believed could never be breached. Yet there, in the sacred waters that had been Christian for over 1,000 years, Ottoman galleys rode at anchor as if they belonged there by right of conquest. The chain itself was a marvel of medieval engineering, forged from massive iron links and suspended between Constantinople and the Genoese colony of Galata. It stretched across the mouth of the Golden Horn like a great metal serpent, its weight supported by wooden floats that kept it at the proper depth to prevent enemy ships from passing either over or under it. For centuries, this barrier had protected the city's harbour from naval assault, forcing attackers to concentrate their efforts on the landward walls while leaving the sea approach secure. The Ottoman solution to this obstacle revealed the genius of Mehmed II and his engineers. Unable to break the chain through direct assault, they chose instead to circumvent it entirely through one of the most audacious engineering feats in military history. During the night of April 21st to 22, the Ottoman fleet was literally carried overland from the Bosphorus to the Golden Horn, transported across the hills of Galata on a road specially constructed for this purpose. The logistics of this operation were staggering in their complexity. Over 70 ships, ranging from small galleys to substantial war vessels, were fitted with wheels and rollers, then hauled by teams of oxen and men across nearly a mile of rough terrain. The road itself had to be specially prepared, with wooden planks laid down to create a smooth surface and steep sections graded to manageable slopes. The entire operation required the coordination of thousands of men, working in perfect silence to avoid alerting the defenders to what was happening. The psychological impact of this maneuver was perhaps even more significant than its military value. The Byzantines had lived for generations with the comforting knowledge that their harbour was secure, that at least one approach to their city remained inviolate. The sight of Ottoman ships in the Golden Horn shattered this illusion and demonstrated that no position was so strong that Ottoman ingenuity could not find a way to overcome it. The defenders realized that they were facing an enemy whose resources and imagination seemed limitless. The immediate military consequences were severe. The Ottoman fleet in the Golden Horn could now threaten the seawall of Constantinople, a much weaker fortification than the great landward walls. The defenders were forced to redeploy their limited forces to guard against assault from this new direction, stretching their already thin ranks even thinner. The city's harbour, which had been a safe haven for supply ships and refuge vessels, became a battleground where Ottoman and Byzantine forces clashed in desperate naval encounters. The moral effect on the city's population was devastating. Many inhabitants saw the appearance of the Ottoman fleet as a sign of divine displeasure, evidence that God had abandoned the last Christian empire to its fate. The superstitious pointed to ancient prophecies that spoke of the city's fall when enemy ships sailed in the Golden Horn, and the appearance of the Turkish fleet seemed to fulfill these dire predictions. The emperor and his advisors worked frantically to maintain morale, but the psychological blow was severe. The Ottoman success also had diplomatic implications that extended far beyond the immediate military situation. The Genoese colony of Galata, which had maintained nominal neutrality throughout the siege, was now directly implicated in the Ottoman victory. The ships had been transported across Genoese territory, and while the colonists claimed that they had been powerless to prevent it, their position became increasingly untenable. The Byzantine defenders began to view the Genoese with suspicion, suspecting treachery where there had been merely weakness. The technical achievement of the overland transport became the subject of admiration even among the city's defenders. Professional soldiers recognized the planning and execution required for such an operation, and even those who faced death as a result of its success could not help but acknowledge the brilliance of the Ottoman strategy. The young Sultan Mehmed had demonstrated that he was not merely a warrior but a military innovator whose vision extended far beyond conventional tactics. The religious interpretations of the event varied dramatically between the two sides. The Ottomans saw the success of the overland transport as evidence of divine favor, proof that Allah supported their holy war against the infidel. Their imam preached sermons comparing the feat to the miracles of the Prophet, while the common soldiers spoke of supernatural assistance in moving the heavy ships across such difficult terrain. The psychological boost to Ottoman morale was enormous, reinforcing their belief that they were destined to conquer the Queen of Cities. The Byzantine response was more complex and anguished. Some saw the Ottoman success as a test of faith, a trial that would prove the devotion of the true believers. Others interpreted it as punishment for the city's sins, particularly the controversial reunion with the Roman Catholic Church that had divided the Orthodox community. The emperor himself maintained public confidence while private, eagerly wrestling with the implications of this devastating setback. The strategic situation had fundamentally changed overnight. The city that had been besieged from the landward side now faced a two-front war, with Ottoman forces positioned to attack from both land and sea. The defenders were forced to construct new fortifications along the seawall, diverting resources and manpower from the already strained defences of the Theodosian walls. The circle of Ottoman power was drawing tighter around the city, and the options for resistance were rapidly narrowing. The practical effects of the naval breakthrough extended beyond military considerations. The Ottoman fleet in the Golden Horn could now intercept any supply ships that might attempt to reach the city, making the siege more complete and effective. The psychological pressure on the defenders increased as they realized that their situation was becoming truly hopeless, that the ancient protections of their city had been overcome by Ottoman ingenuity and determination. The event marked a turning point in the siege, the moment when the outcome shifted from uncertain to inevitable. The defenders would continue to fight with desperate courage, but the appearance of the Ottoman fleet in the Golden Horn had demonstrated that their enemy possessed both the will and the capability to overcome any obstacle. The great chain, which had protected the city for so many centuries, had been rendered irrelevant by the audacity of a young sultan who refused to accept that anything was impossible. As the Ottoman ships took their positions in the harbour, their crews preparing for the final assault on the seawall, the defenders of Constantinople understood that they were witnessing something more than a military manoeuvre. They were seeing the birth of a new age, an era in which traditional fortifications and ancient strategies would give way to innovation and adaptation. The ships in the Golden Horn were harbingers of a world in which the old certainties would no longer apply. and the last defenders of Byzantium would have to face this new reality with whatever courage and faith they could muster. The 29th of May, 1453, dawned with a stillness that seemed to hold the very breath of history. In the pre-dawn darkness, as the first faint light began to touch the eastern horizon, the greatest army the medieval world had ever assembled prepared for its final assault on the last stronghold of the Roman Empire. The silence was profound and ominous, broken only by the whispered prayers of men who understood that this day would reshape the map of the world and determine the fate of civilizations. Mehmed II had spent the night in prayer and contemplation, kneeling on his prayer rug in the great tent that served as his command center. The young sultan understood that this day would define his reign and his legacy, that he would either emerge as the conqueror of Constantinople or face the catastrophic failure of his greatest ambition. Around him, his generals and advisors made their final preparations, checking weapons, reviewing battle plans, and offering their own prayers to Allah for victory in the holy war against the infidel. The Ottoman battle plan was a masterpiece of military coordination designed to exploit every advantage that the besiegers possessed while minimizing the strengths of the defenders. The assault would come in 3 waves, each with its own specific objectives and tactical role. The first wave would consist of the irregular troops, the Bashi bazouks and volunteers from across the Islamic world who had flocked to the Sultan's banner. These men, though brave and numerous, were not professional soldiers, and their primary function was to exhaust the defenders and probe for weaknesses in the fortifications. The second wave would comprise the Anatolian infantry, the core of the Ottoman army's regular forces. These troops were disciplined and experienced, equipped with the finest weapons the empire could provide. Their task was to exploit the gaps and weaknesses revealed by the first assault, to push through the breaches created by weeks of artillery bombardment and establish footholds within the city's defenses. The third and final wave would be the Janissaries, the elite corps of the Ottoman army, whose very name struck fear into the hearts of their enemies. These soldiers, recruited as children from Christian families and raised in the Islamic faith, were the most disciplined and fanatical troops in the world. They had never known defeat, and their loyalty to the Sultan was absolute. If anyone could break through the legendary walls of Constantinople, it would be these white-capped warriors whose curved swords had carved out an empire spanning 3 continents. As the sun rose over the Bosphorus, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to prophesy the bloodshed to come, the Ottoman artillery began its final bombardment. The great guns, which had been pounding the walls for nearly 2 months, now concentrated their fire on the sections where the breaches were largest and most promising. The sound was deafening, a continuous roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds smashed into the ancient masonry with tremendous force, sending up clouds of dust and debris that obscured the battlefield like a fog of war. Within the city, Constantine XI prepared for his final battle with the dignity befitting the last emperor of Rome. He had spent the night in prayer at the Hagia Sophia, kneeling before the altar where his predecessors had been crowned for over 1,000 years. The emperor understood that this day would see either the miraculous preservation of his empire or its final extinction, and he was prepared for either outcome with the serene courage of a man who had made his peace with fate. The emperor's final speech to his defenders was brief but powerful, delivered from the walls where he had stood beside his men throughout the long siege. He spoke of the glorious history of their city, of the thousands of years of civilization that they were defending, of the sacred duty to protect the last bastion of Eastern Christianity. His words were simple but profound, touching on themes that resonated with every man present: duty, honor, faith, and the willingness to die for something greater than oneself. Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese condottiere who had become the soul of the city's resistance, made his own preparations with the methodical care of a professional soldier. He checked his weapons, adjusted his armor, and positioned his men at the most critical points of the defense. The The Genoese crossbowmen, who had proven themselves time and again during the siege, were ready to sell their lives dearly in defense of a city that had become their adopted home. The first Ottoman assault began at dawn, with the irregular troops surging forward with wild cries and brandished weapons. These men, driven by religious fervor and the promise of plunder, threw themselves against the walls with reckless courage. The defenders met them with a storm of arrows, crossbow bolts, and Greek fire that turned the approaches to the walls into a killing ground. The attackers pressed forward over the bodies of their fallen comrades, driven by a fanaticism that seemed to transcend the fear of death. The battle raged for hours, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. The Ottoman irregulars fought with desperate courage, but they lacked the discipline and equipment necessary to break through the still formidable defenses. The defenders, though vastly outnumbered, held their positions with the tenacity of men who knew that retreat meant not just defeat, but extinction. The walls of Constantinople, which had turned back so many previous assaults, seemed once again to be fulfilling their ancient purpose. The second wave of the assault brought fresh challenges for the defenders. The Anatolian infantry advanced with greater discipline and coordination than their predecessors, their ranks dressed and their movements coordinated by experienced officers. These men knew their business, and they pressed their attacks with the systematic persistence of professional soldiers. The defenders found themselves hard-pressed to maintain their positions as the weight of numbers began to tell against their increasingly exhausted ranks. It was during this phase of the battle that disaster struck the Christian cause. Giovanni Giustiniani, the architect of the city's defense, was struck by a crossbow bolt that penetrated his armor and inflicted a grievous wound. The sight of their commander falling sent a wave of panic through the Genoese contingent, and despite the pleas of the emperor himself, they carried their wounded leader from the field. The departure of the Genoese at this critical moment created a gap in the defenses that the Ottomans were quick to exploit. The third and final wave of the assault saw the Janissaries entering the battle with their characteristic discipline and ferocity. These elite troops, advancing behind their distinctive white banners, struck the weakened defenses like a thunderbolt. Their training and equipment were superior to anything the defenders could match, and their fanatical loyalty to the Sultan drove them forward even when the odds seemed impossible. The sight of the Janissaries breaking through the outer defenses sent a thrill of triumph through the Ottoman ranks, and a chill of despair through the hearts of the defenders. The breach in the walls became a focal point of the most desperate fighting of the entire siege. Ottoman soldiers poured through the gap like water through a broken dam, while the defenders fought with the fury of men who knew that their civilization was as dying around them. The emperor himself joined the melee, his purple boots treading the same ground as common soldiers as he fought to stem the tide of invasion. The last emperor of Byzantium had chosen to die as a warrior rather than a suppliant, and his courage inspired his men to superhuman efforts. The fall of the outer defences triggered a general collapse of the Byzantine position. Ottoman forces, having broken through at several points, began to roll up the remaining defenders along the length of the walls. The systematic defence that had held for so long dissolved into a series of isolated fights, as individual groups of defenders made their last stands. The sounds of battle, the clash of steel, the cries of the wounded, the shouts of victory and despair echoed through the streets of the city as the final act of the Byzantine Empire played out in fire and blood. The death of Constantine XI marked the end of more than just a battle. It marked the end of an empire that had endured for over 1,000 years. The emperor's body, found among the heaps of slain after the fighting ended, was identified only by the purple boots that marked his imperial rank. The man who had borne the name of the city's founder had died as he had lived, with dignity, courage, and an unshakable commitment to his duty as the last guardian of Roman civilization. The Ottoman victory was complete and overwhelming. The city that had been the terror of barbarian tribes and the envy of medieval princes lay open to the conquerors, its ancient walls breached, its emperor dead, its defenders scattered. The soldiers of Islam poured through the streets of Constantinople like a conquering flood, their cries of Allahu Akbar echoing from the ancient stones that had heard the prayers of Christians for over a millennium. The transformation of the Hagia Sophia from church to mosque symbolized the complete nature of the Ottoman and victory. The great cathedral, which had been the heart of Eastern Christianity for nearly 1,000 years, was cleared of its Christian symbols and prepared for Islamic worship. The sound of the muezzin's call to prayer, rising from the dome where Christian chants had echoed for centuries, announced to the world that a new age had begun, that the last connection between the modern world and the classical civilization of Greece and Rome had been severed forever. As the sun set on May 29, 1453, it set also on the Byzantine Empire and rose on the Ottoman Empire as the dominant power in the Eastern Mediterranean. The young sultan who had dreamed of conquering Constantinople had achieved his ambition, but the price paid by both sides had been enormous. The city that had been the queen of cities, the bridge between worlds, the last heir of ancient Rome, had fallen at last to the forces of a new age, and the medieval world had ended with the sound of Ottoman guns echoing from the walls of the city that had defied them for so long. The silence that followed the Ottoman victory was profound and unsettling, broken only by the distant sound of flames crackling through the city's abandoned quarters and the occasional cry of a wounded man calling for help. Mehmed II, now 21 years old and master of the city that had haunted his dreams since childhood, rode through the streets of Constantinople with the measured pace of a conqueror who understood the weight of history settling upon his shoulders. The young sultan, who had been known simply as Mehmed the Conqueror, was now something more. He was the heir to Caesar, the master of the Queen of Cities, the ruler who had united Europe and Asia under a single crown. The Sultan's first act upon entering the conquered city revealed the complexity of his character and the sophistication of his vision. Rather than allowing his soldiers to sack the city in the traditional manner of medieval warfare, Mehmed quickly imposed discipline and order. He understood that Constantinople's value lay not in its portable wealth, but in its strategic position, its population, and its potential as the capital of a great empire. The city that he had spent 2 years preparing to conquer, he now began immediately to transform into the crown jewel of the Ottoman Empire. The great cathedral of Hagia Sophia became the focal point of this transformation. Mehmed entered the ancient church on horseback, his boots echoing in the vast space that had been the heart of Eastern Christianity for nearly 1,000 years. The sight that greeted him was both magnificent and melancholy, soaring domes and glittering mosaics that spoke of human artistic achievement at its highest level, but also empty spaces and damaged decorations that testified to the recent trauma of conquest. The Sultan dismounted and knelt in prayer, offering thanks to Allah for the victory that had been granted to him. Conversion of Hagia Sophia to a mosque was carried out with remarkable care and respect for the building's architectural integrity. The Christian mosaics were not destroyed but covered with plaster, preserved beneath Islamic decorations that would allow future generations to witness the continuity of religious and artistic tradition. The Great Dome, which had been the wonder of the medieval world, was crowned with a crescent that announced the building's new function while respecting its ancient grandeur. The transformation was symbolic of the Ottoman approach to conquest, not destruction, but adaptation, not erasure, but synthesis. The city's population faced a complex and uncertain future under their new rulers. The Ottoman tradition of devshirme, the collection of Christian boys for training as janissaries and government officials, would continue, but it would be balanced by policies designed to encourage the existing population to remain and contribute to the city's prosperity. Mehmed understood that a city without people was merely a collection of empty buildings, and he worked to create conditions that would attract both Muslim settlers and Christian inhabitants to his new capital. The economic transformation of Constantinople under Ottoman rule was dramatic and far-reaching. The city's position at the crossroads of trade routes between Europe and Asia made it a natural commercial center, and Ottoman policies encouraged the development of commerce and industry. The famous Grand Bazaar, one of the world's first covered markets, began to take shape as merchants from across the empire gathered to trade in the city's protected environment. The guilds that had regulated Byzantine commerce were reorganized along Ottoman lines, but their essential functions remained unchanged. The architectural transformation of the city reflected the Ottoman synthesis of different cultural traditions. The great palace complex of Topkapi, built on the site of the ancient Byzantine Acropolis, combined Islamic architectural principles with Byzantine spatial concepts and Western Renaissance decorative elements. The result was a unique architectural style that was recognizably Ottoman while acknowledging the city's complex cultural heritage. The palace gardens, with their carefully planned vistas and water features, created spaces of contemplation and beauty that rivaled the greatest achievements of Islamic landscape architecture. The religious transformation of Constantinople was perhaps the most complex aspect of the Ottoman conquest. While the city became officially Islamic, with mosques replacing churches as the centers of religious life, the new rulers recognized the practical necessity of accommodating the Christian population that remained. The Orthodox Patriarch was confirmed in his position, though now under Ottoman authority, and the Greek Orthodox Church was allowed to maintain its traditions and practices within the framework of Islamic law. This religious pluralism, while not based on modern concepts of equality, represented a pragmatic approach to governing a multi-religious population. The intellectual and cultural life of the city experienced both continuity and change under Ottoman rule. The Islamic scholarly tradition, with its emphasis on law, theology, and philosophy, was established in new madrasas and centers of learning. At the same time, the Ottoman court became a patron of arts and letters, attracting scholars, poets, and artists from across the Islamic world. The synthesis of different cultural traditions created a unique intellectual environment that would flourish for centuries. The impact of the conquest extended far beyond the city itself. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves through the Christian world, confirming the rise of the Ottoman Empire as a major power that would have to be reckoned with by all the established kingdoms of Europe. The refugees who fled the city carried with them not only their personal possessions, but also manuscripts, artistic traditions, and intellectual knowledge that would contribute to the European Renaissance. The Greek scholars who found refuge in Western universities brought with them a deep knowledge of classical texts that had been preserved in Byzantine libraries for centuries. The Ottoman Empire's expansion continued in the decades following the conquest, with the capture of Constantinople serving as a springboard for further territorial gains. The Balkans, much of Hungary, and large parts of the Mediterranean fell under Ottoman control, creating an empire that stretched from the gates of Vienna to the shores of the Indian Ocean. The city that had been the capital of the Byzantine Empire became the capital of an even greater empire, one that would dominate the politics of 3 continents for the next 4 centuries. The legacy of the conquest was complex and multifaceted. For the Islamic world, it represented the triumph of faith over infidelity, the successful completion of a holy war that had been waged for centuries. For the Christian world, it marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new phase in the long struggle between Christianity and Islam. For the city itself, it meant transformation from a declining Byzantine capital to a thriving Ottoman metropolis, from a symbol of the past to a center of contemporary power and culture. The cultural synthesis that emerged from the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople created something entirely new in the medieval world. The city became a place where Islamic, Christian, and Jewish traditions coexisted and influenced each other, where Eastern and Western architectural styles blended into new forms, where the intellectual traditions of different civilizations met and mingled. This cultural diversity, while not without its tensions and conflicts, created a unique environment that would contribute to human civilization for centuries to come. The personal transformation of Mehmed II from a young prince with ambitious dreams to the ruler of a great empire was emblematic of the broader changes that the conquest represented. The Sultan, who had spent his youth studying the classics of Greek and Roman literature, now ruled over the city that had been the last link to those ancient civilizations. His vision of empire, which combined Islamic religious principles with pragmatic administrative practices, would shape the development of the Ottoman Empire for generations to come. As the first Ottoman decade in Constantinople drew to a close, the city that had been the queen of cities under the Byzantines was becoming the pearl of the Ottoman Empire. The transformation was not complete. It would take generations to fully integrate the different cultural and religious traditions that now coexisted within the city's walls. But the foundations had been laid for a new synthesis, a new form of civilization that would bridge the gap between medieval and modern, between East and West, between the world that had been and the world that was to come. The fall of Constantinople on that fateful May morning in 1453 sent tremors through the consciousness of Europe that would resonate for centuries. The news traveled swiftly along the trade routes and diplomatic channels that connected the medieval world, carried by merchants, refugees, and ambassadors who understood that they were reporting not merely the conquest of a city, but the end of an era. In the courts of Western Europe, the reaction was a complex mixture of shock, fear, and grudging admiration for the military prowess that had achieved what so many previous attempts had failed to accomplish. The immediate consequences of the conquest were felt most acutely by the Greek scholars and intellectuals who had made Constantinople their home. These men, the inheritors of an unbroken tradition of classical learning that stretched back to ancient Athens, found themselves suddenly without a patron or a homeland. Many fled westward, carrying with them not only their personal libraries, but also the accumulated wisdom of centuries. The manuscripts they brought, works of Plato and Aristotle, of Byzantine historians and theologians, of mathematicians and scientists, would fuel the intellectual renaissance that was already beginning to transform Western Europe. The University of Padua, the courts of the Italian princes, the emerging centers of learning in Northern Europe, all became beneficiaries of this forced migration of scholars. The Greek language, which had been a rarity in Western universities, suddenly became accessible to scholars who could learn it from native speakers. The philosophical and scientific texts that had been preserved in Byzantine libraries found new audiences among Western intellectuals who were eager to explore the full scope of classical knowledge. The conquest of Constantinople, while ending one chapter of intellectual history, opened another that would prove equally significant. The political implications of the Ottoman victory extended far beyond the immediate region of the Eastern Mediterranean. The emergence of the Ottoman Empire as a major European power fundamentally altered the balance of forces that had shaped medieval politics. The traditional rivalry between France and the Holy Roman Empire was complicated by the appearance of a new player whose territories bordered both powers and whose military capabilities had been demonstrated in the most dramatic fashion possible. The Ottoman threat would become a central concern of European diplomacy for the next 3 centuries. The religious impact of the conquest was equally profound. The transformation of Hagia Sophia from the greatest church in Eastern Christianity to a mosque symbolized the retreat of Christianity from territories it had held for over a millennium. The Orthodox churches of Eastern Europe, which had looked to Constantinople as their spiritual center, were forced to develop new forms of identity and organization. The Patriarch of Constantinople, though allowed to continue his functions under Ottoman rule, now served a drastically reduced community of believers scattered across an Islamic empire. Yet the cultural legacy of Byzantine Constantinople proved remarkably resilient. The architectural traditions established during the Byzantine period continued to influence Ottoman builders, who incorporated elements of Byzantine design into their own mosques and palaces. The administrative systems developed by Byzantine emperors provided models for Ottoman governance, adapted to Islamic law and practice, but retaining their essential characteristics. The commercial networks that had made Constantinople the crossroads of the medieval world continued to function under Ottoman rule, ensuring the city's continued prosperity and importance. The city itself underwent a remarkable transformation in the decades following the conquest. The population, which had fallen to perhaps 100,000 at the time of the siege, grew rapidly as Muslims from across the empire settled in the former Byzantine capital. New neighborhoods were established, new mosques and schools were built, and the city's commercial districts expanded to accommodate the growing trade that flowed through Ottoman territories. By the end of the 15th century, Constantinople had become one of the largest and most prosperous cities in the world. The Ottoman Empire's expansion in the wake of the conquest transformed the political map of Europe and the Mediterranean. The capture of Belgrade in 1521, the siege of Vienna in 1529, the conquest of Cyprus in 1571, each of these events demonstrated the continued expansion of Ottoman power and the inability of European powers to develop effective strategies for containing it. The empire that had been born from the conquest of Constantinople became the greatest military and political force of the early modern period. The cultural synthesis that emerged from Ottoman rule in Constantinople created new forms of artistic and intellectual expression that drew on multiple traditions. Ottoman architecture, while distinctly Islamic in its religious symbolism, incorporated elements from Byzantine, Persian, and European sources to create a unique style that would influence building design throughout the Islamic world. The decorative arts flourished under Ottoman patronage, producing carpets, ceramics, and metalwork that were prized from London to Baghdad for their beauty and craftsmanship. The intellectual life of the city reflected this same synthesis of traditions. The madrasas established by the Ottomans became centers of Islamic learning that attracted scholars from across the empire, while the continuation of Greek or Orthodox institutions ensured that Christian scholarly traditions also survived. The Ottoman court became a patron of poetry, history, and philosophy, encouraging the development of a distinctive Ottoman literary culture that drew on Turkish, Persian, and Arabic sources, while remaining open to influences from the conquered territories. The impact of the conquest on European military thinking was profound and lasting. The successful use of artillery against the supposedly impregnable walls of Constantinople demonstrated that traditional fortifications were no longer adequate against modern weapons. The Star Fort, with its angled bastions designed to withstand cannon fire, became the new standard for defensive architecture. The Ottoman janissaries, with their discipline and firepower, served as models for the professional armies that would dominate European warfare in the centuries to come. The economic consequences of the conquest extended throughout the Mediterranean world. The Ottoman control of Constantinople and the surrounding straits gave them the ability to regulate trade between Europe and Asia, imposing customs duties and controlling the flow of goods that had previously moved freely through Byzantine territories. This economic power became one of the foundations of Ottoman wealth and influence, funding the military campaigns that would extend the empire's borders throughout the 16th century. The religious and cultural impact of the conquest was felt most keenly in the Orthodox Christian world. The Patriarch of Moscow began to assert claims to leadership of the Orthodox Church, arguing that with the fall of Constantinople, Moscow had become the Third Rome and the protector of true Christianity. This claim would have profound implications for Russian foreign policy and cultural identity, contributing to the development of Russian imperial ambitions that would shape European politics for centuries. The refugees who fled Constantinople in the wake of the conquest carried with them not only their personal possessions, but also their cultural traditions and religious practices. Greek Orthodox communities in Venice, Vienna, and other European cities became centers of Byzantine culture in exile, preserving liturgical traditions, manuscript collections, and artistic techniques that might otherwise have been lost. These communities served as bridges between the Byzantine past and the European present, ensuring that the cultural legacy of Constantinople would survive even after the political entity that had created it had disappeared. The transformation of Constantinople into Istanbul represented more than just a change of name. It symbolized the city's evolution from a Christian capital to an Islamic metropolis. The great mosques built by Ottoman architects, while acknowledging the city's Christian heritage, created new skylines and new sacred spaces that reflected the religious and cultural values of the new rulers. The city's population became increasingly diverse, with Muslims, Christians, and Jews living side by side in a complex but generally peaceful coexistence. The long-term historical significance of the conquest cannot be overstated. The fall of Constantinople marked the end of the medieval period and the beginning of the early modern era in European history. The Ottoman Empire that emerged from this conquest would dominate Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean for the next 4 centuries, serving as both a military threat and a cultural bridge between East and West. The city that had been the last link to the Roman Empire became the first capital of a new kind of empire, one that would synthesize Islamic, Christian, and secular traditions in ways that would influence the development of the modern world. The scholarly traditions that had been preserved in Constantinople's libraries and schools found new homes in the universities and courts of Western Europe, contributing to the Renaissance and the scientific revolution. The Greek manuscripts that had been copied and recopied by Byzantine scholars provided European intellectuals with access to classical texts that had been lost in the West, fueling the rediscovery of ancient philosophy, mathematics, and science that would transform European culture. The military innovations that had made the conquest possible, the use of artillery, the coordination of land and sea forces, the systematic approach to siege warfare, became standard elements of European military practice. The Ottoman Empire's success in adapting these techniques to their own cultural and religious contexts demonstrated that military innovation was not limited to Christian Europe, but could emerge from any civilization that was willing to embrace new technologies and tactics. The conquest of Constantinople thus stands as one of the great turning points in world history, marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. The city that had been the queen of cities under the Byzantines became the pearl of the Ottoman Empire, serving as a bridge between civilizations and a center of cultural synthesis that would influence the development of both European and Islamic civilizations for centuries to come. The echoes of that fateful day in May 1453 continue to resonate in the modern world, reminding us that the great movements of history often turn on single moments of decision, courage, and transformation. As the centuries have passed since that momentous day in May 1453, Constantinople has continued to evolve, layer upon layer of history accumulating like sediment in the consciousness of humanity. The city that witnessed the end of the Roman Empire and the rise of the Ottoman Empire has seen the birth of the modern Turkish Republic, the transformation of empires into nation-states, and the emergence of a globalized world that Constantine the Great could never have imagined. Yet through all these changes, certain eternal qualities have persisted, making Istanbul, as the city is now known, a living bridge between past and future, between East and West, between the mortal concerns of daily life and the immortal aspirations of human civilization. The physical city itself bears witness to this layered history in ways that continue to astonish visitors from around the world. The Hagia Sophia, which began as a Christian cathedral, served as a mosque for nearly 5 centuries, and now stands as a museum and mosque once again, embodies the complex religious and cultural heritage that defines the city's character. The building's great dome, which inspired both Byzantine architects and Ottoman builders, continues to dominate the skyline as it has for over 15 centuries, a testament to the enduring power of human artistic vision to transcend the political and religious divisions that separate different eras. The archaeological discoveries that continue to emerge from beneath the city's streets reveal the extraordinary depth of its historical foundations. Roman columns support Byzantine churches, which in turn provided stones for Ottoman mosques, which themselves have been restored using modern techniques that preserve their historical integrity while adapting them to contemporary needs. The city's underground cisterns, built by Roman engineers and expanded by Byzantine builders, still provide glimpses into the sophisticated urban planning that made Constantinople the largest and most prosperous city of its time. The cultural synthesis that began with the Ottoman conquest has continued to evolve in ways that reflect the changing nature of Turkish society and the broader world. The city's music, cuisine, and literature draw on traditions that span continents and centuries, creating forms of expression that are uniquely Istanbul while remaining connected to the broader currents of human culture. The Turkish language itself, which was transformed by Ottoman administrators and modern reformers, bears traces of Arabic, Persian, Greek, and European influences that reflect the city's role as a meeting place of civilizations. The economic life of modern Istanbul continues to reflect its historical role as a crossroads of trade and commerce. The Grand Bazaar, one of the oldest covered markets in the world, still operates as it has for centuries, though its vendors now sell to tourists as well as locals, and its ancient rhythms have been overlaid with the tempo of modern business. The city's position at the junction of Europe and Asia has made it a natural center for contemporary trade and finance, just as it was in the days of Byzantine and Ottoman merchants. The religious landscape of the city has evolved to accommodate the secular nature of modern Turkey, while preserving the spiritual traditions that have sustained its inhabitants for centuries. The call to prayer that echoes from the city's minarets 5 times each day creates a sonic landscape that connects the present to the past, while the continued presence of Christian and Jewish communities ensures that the city's religious diversity, though changed in proportion and character, remains a defining characteristic of urban life. The intellectual tradition that made Constantinople a center of learning and scholarship has found new expression in the universities and cultural institutions of modern Istanbul. The manuscripts that were once preserved in the libraries of the Byzantine palace and the Ottoman court now reside in modern research libraries where scholars from around the world come to study the complex history of this remarkable city. The synthesis of different intellectual traditions that characterized both Byzantine and Ottoman culture continues in the work of contemporary Turkish scholars who seek to understand their city's place in world history. The architectural landscape of Istanbul continues to evolve, with modern buildings rising alongside ancient monuments in a juxtaposition that sometimes creates tensions, but more often demonstrates the city's capacity to adapt and change while preserving its essential character. The bridges that span the Bosphorus, connecting Europe and Asia with engineering marvels that rival the great construction projects of the past, serve as metaphors for the city's continuing role as a bridge between different worlds and different ways of understanding human experience. The city's relationship with water, the Bosphorus, the Golden Horn, the Sea of Marmara, remains as central to its identity as it was in the days of Constantine and Mehmed. The ferries that carry passengers between the European and Asian sides of the city follow routes that have been traveled for millennia, and the sight of the city's silhouette rising from the water continues to inspire the same sense of wonder that it evoked in medieval travelers. The interplay between land and water, between built environment and natural setting, creates a visual harmony that transcends the particular architectural styles of any single period. The human story of Istanbul continues to unfold in the lives of its millions of inhabitants, each of whom carries forward some aspect of the city's complex heritage. The descendants of Byzantine Greeks, Ottoman Turks, Armenian merchants, Jewish refugees, and more recent immigrants from across Turkey and the world create a human tapestry that is both contemporary and eternal. Their daily lives, while shaped by the concerns of the modern world, take place against the backdrop of a city that has witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the birth and death of civilizations, and the endless cycle of human ambition and achievement. The lessons that the city offers to the modern world are both practical and philosophical. The successful integration of different cultural and religious traditions, while never perfect and often marked by conflict, demonstrates the possibility of creating diverse societies that can function despite their internal differences. The city's capacity to adapt to changing circumstances while preserving its essential character offers a model for how human communities can navigate the challenges of historical change without losing their identity or their sense of purpose. The story of Constantinople's fall and Istanbul's rise serves as a reminder that the great movements of history often occur at the intersection of different civilizations, where the meeting of different traditions creates both conflict and opportunity. The city that was born from the collision of Christian and Islamic civilizations became a place where both traditions could coexist and influence each other, creating new forms of culture and society that were richer and more complex than either could have achieved alone. As we consider the eternal qualities that have made this city a center of human civilization for over 2 millennia, we are reminded that the most important human achievements are not the products of any single culture or civilization, but emerge from the creative interaction between different ways of understanding the world. The Constantinople that fell in 1453 was itself the product of such interactions. Roman law and Greek philosophy, Christian theology and classical learning, Eastern mysticism and Western pragmatism. The Istanbul that rose from its ashes has continued this tradition of synthesis and adaptation, creating new forms of culture and society that honor the past while embracing the future. The city sleeps now by the waters of the Bosphorus, its ancient stones bathed in the gentle light of stars that have shone down upon it since before the birth of Christ. The sounds of the modern world, traffic, conversation, music, gradually fade as the night deepens, leaving only the eternal sounds of wind and water that have provided the city's soundtrack for thousands of years. In this peaceful darkness, the boundaries between past and present, between East and West, between the sacred and the secular, seem to dissolve, revealing the underlying unity that connects all human experience across time and space. The city dreams, and in its dreams, the voices of all who have lived and died within its walls continue to speak. Constantine the Great and Mehmed the Conqueror, Justinian and Suleiman the Magnificent, the anonymous craftsmen who built its monuments, and the countless ordinary people who have called it home, all are present in the city's eternal memory, their hopes and dreams, their triumphs and tragedies, woven into the fabric of a place that has transcended the particular circumstances of its creation to become a symbol of humanity's greatest aspirations and achievements. In the end, the story of Constantinople's fall and Istanbul's rise is not just the story of a city, but the story of civilization itself, the endless cycle of creation and destruction, of rise and fall, of death and rebirth that defines the human experience. The city that has witnessed so much history continues to create new history, carrying forward the best of the past while embracing the possibilities of the future, serving as a bridge between what was and what might be, between the mortal concerns of daily life and the immortal aspirations that define our humanity.